As summer winds down, I'm all about refreshing my wardrobe with staple pieces for the season ahead. Quince nails it with the luxe essentials that feel effortless and look polished, perfect for layering and mixing. Their styles are so versatile, I find myself reaching for them again and again. By working directly with top artisans and cutting out the middlemen, Quince gives you luxury without the markup, and they only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes. A pair of Quince aviator sunglasses recently made it into my wardrobe. I'd been wanting to buy a pair of aviator sunglasses, but the brand name ones were too expensive, and the ones I get at the drugstore break so quickly. Enter Quince, where the price point is reasonable and the quality is high. Join me in elevating your fall wardrobe essentials with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
If we continue to consciously comply in situations, it really does have a toll. So we often think about the costs of defiance, I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to lose a relationship, I'm going to be affected in this way. And we focus on those, and they are the things that keep us silent. But we don't think in the same way about the costs of compliance, which are really quite high if we're constantly bowing our head to other people, if we're constantly putting aside our values and sacrificing those. It can take a toll on us emotionally, psychologically, and then, of course, physically, if it leads to stress, burnout, dissatisfaction. All of these things affect us.
That was Sunita Sah on Psychologists Off the Clock. We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Act Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and an upcoming book about misunderstanding.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hey listeners, we're about to jump into my interview with Sunita Sah, but first, just a quick reminder to stay tuned until the end, where you can hear my co-host debrief with Debbie, and also a reminder that you can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website, or you can go to patreon.com/offtheclockpsych. And if Patreon isn't for you, but you want to help us out, you can do so by sharing this episode with someone you think might benefit from learning a little bit about Defiance. And now here's the show. Hey everybody, it's Jill here, and I have been looking forward to this interview for a very long time. I have Dr. Sunita Sah with me today. She is a national best-selling author, an award-winning professor at Cornell University, and an expert in organizational psychology. She leads groundbreaking research on influence, authority, compliance, and defiance. A trained physician, she practiced medicine in the UK and worked as a management consultant for the pharmaceutical industry. She currently teaches executives, leaders, and students in healthcare and business. Dr. Sah is a sought-after international speaker and consultant, advisor to government agencies, and former commissioner of the National Commission on Forensic Science. Her multidisciplinary research and analyses have been widely published in leading academic journals and media entities, including the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Harvard Business Review, and Scientific American. She lives with her husband and son in New York, and she is the author of the brilliant book, Defy, The Power of No in a World That Demands Yes, and that is what we are here to talk about today. Sunita, welcome. I'm so excited to have you on Psychologists Off the Clock.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me and for that lovely introduction.
Well, I've been looking forward to this for a while. I loved everything about this book, including the great title. I'm always very happy for authors when they come up with a great title, and this is a great title. And, there are just so many compelling and like perfectly illustrative stories that you share throughout the book. And I wanted to start with the very first thing that I loved that was on the pages that are still numbered with Roman numerals. It was so early in the book. And that is the way that you present your old and new definitions of the verb defy. So the Oxford English Dictionary defines defy as, quote, to challenge the power of, to resist boldly or openly. But you include that as the old definition. So tell us how you define this word define, your new definition of the verb defy.
So, one of the things in my research when I was looking at sort of compliance and defiance was how much we actually comply when we don't want to. And really the reason for my fascination with this topic was both personal and professional. I grew up with what I call a masterclass in compliance. And so I was always fascinated by people that could say no and act in the way that they wanted to. But for many of us, when we grow up and we're socialized to be compliant, and for me, I remember asking my dad at some point, what does my name mean in Sanskrit? And he said, Sunita means good. We start equating compliance with being good and defiance with being bad. And what does good actually mean? It means to be polite, to be nice, to obey, to do as you're told. And so I always thought of defiance as being something bad, like it's some negative connotation. But then when I delved in my research, how many problems blind obedience and compliance can bring about, that's when I came to this revelation that we need a new definition for defiance. And it's really important that we understand sort of different aspects of what compliance really means, what defiance means, what consent means. So my definition of defiance is to defy is simply to act in accordance with your true values, especially when there is pressure to do otherwise. So we reframe it from this negative connotation to a proactive, positive force in society, because our everyday acts of compliance and dissent, they create the society that we live in. So it affects our lives, our workplaces, our communities. And that's why I'm very passionate about it.
Yes, I love it. I think that is so incredibly powerful. And I was going to ask you to define the meaning of your name in Sanskrit. You shared that in the book. And I thought, oh my gosh, she was like meant to write this book. It was like written in the stars right from the day she was named. So let's jump in and talk a little bit more about defiance and compliance, because you say that these are not binary, but that they really exist on a continuum. That defiance is a process that really encompasses this gradation of understanding, of questioning, of action. So can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. So what I mean by compliance is something that's often externally imposed. We either slide into it without thinking because it's been our default response from childhood, which makes it very difficult to overcome. But it's usually something that we either slide into or a yes that's not quite a yes. We feel pressurized in some way. So there's either an order, a suggestion, or even expectations from society. And so we say yes when we would rather not. Now, defiance, people often think that's just, well, then say no. But what I've realized in a lot of the research that I've done and examining sort of people that say yes and say no is that we often don't get to that no straight away. And I've identified these 5 stages of defiance that many of us go through when we're thinking about saying no or rejecting somebody's order or suggestion or expectation. And those stages don't need to go in order. We don't need to experience them all the time. We can skip them. We can go back and forth, as I've often done. But understanding that it is a process. It's a process of, first of all, learning and training and recognizing these aspects of defiance. So let me just tell you the very first stage to begin with, which is tension. So we often feel tension when we're asked to do something that we would rather not do. And actually, a lot of people think of that tension as some kind of weakness. They try to get rid of it or sweep it under the carpet. They think it's not worth our anxiety or doubt that somebody else knows better, or if everybody else is doing it, then it must be fine. But that tension
like
is
it's
actually
like I'm the problem. Like this tension must
Exactly.
signal that like there's something wrong with me, that I'm feeling uncomfortable.
Yes, I don't have, I'm not comfortable with this, but it's me that has to do something.
Yeah.
And what I realize is not you, it's the situation. And the fact that you actually feel tension is very powerful. Like tension is actually your strength. If you had given away all your agency and all your power, you wouldn't feel any tension. You would just be, okay, fine. But the fact that you feel that is that you are already thinking something's not quite right here. Maybe this is the time to defy. And so that in itself is a progression. It's like the first stage is feeling that tension. And the second stage is actually acknowledging it, not dismissing it, but acknowledging it to ourselves that this is important. This might be a situation in which I need to defy. So that aspect, and I can go through the other stages if you like.
Yeah, I think that would be great. Yeah.
So stage 1, feeling that tension. Stage 2, acknowledging it to yourself. So really acknowledging and saying, I feel tension in this situation. Don't try to sweep it away, but register, why is it? Why is it that I'm feeling tension? Is something going against my values in this situation? What is it? Try to identify it. And then stage 3 is actually a really critical stage, because what the research shows is if you can get to stage 3, you're much more likely to get to the end stage 5. Why? Because stage 3 is about vocalizing your discomfort to someone else. Now, this doesn't need to be done with a confrontation. It doesn't need to be done in a loud or aggressive way. You can actually just ask for clarification rather than confrontation. You can ask questions, and you can still be in a subservient position if that's what you want. You're just asking, what do you mean by that? Oh, have you considered this? Can you clarify this for me? You're asking questions to understand the situation in more depth. And then if you decide this is going against my values and I do need to say no in this situation, stage 4 is that acknowledgement to the other person that I can't go along with this. It's that almost, you can call it a threat, but it's just really communicating non-compliance, that I don't think I can do this. This is not right for me. People often get to this stage and then they're worn down and can go back. And so it's just being insistent at this stage, like this is not the right thing for me. And once we get to that stage, it's just a tiny leap then to get to stage 5, which is your act of defiance. And what's really fascinating about that last stage of defiance is that tension that we had right at the very beginning in stage 1, if you can defy and you're acting in alignment with your values, that tension just dissipates. It melts away. And then you are left living and being more authentic with who you are, living in alignment with your values. It's a more honest, more joyful life than keeping that tension, because even if you think you can sweep it away, it comes back and it builds resentment and regret and many other negative emotions.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm sure you've had the experience. The greatest thing about writing a book is when you have people give you specific examples of how this has affected them, changed them, helped them. And knowing, you've got a whole bunch of people who have read this book who are carrying you around on their shoulders. And I had this experience. You were with me without even knowing it, when I had made an appointment for my daughter to see a new medical provider. And we showed up the first time and they had made a mistake and didn't have us in their books. So that was fine. Everyone makes mistakes and these things happen. No big deal. We rescheduled. Now, that time that we did show up and they didn't have us on the books, she made us wait. She talked to a drug sales rep for 10 minutes while we were sitting in the waiting room. So it wasn't positive. And then she chatted with us for a few minutes and asked my daughter's only 13, asked her several pretty personal questions that involved her private health information with the door wide open. And so my daughter was already a little uncomfortable. But we make the appointment to come back, and we come back a few weeks later. And I'm sitting there and 5 minutes goes by and 10 minutes goes by. And finally at the 13-minute mark, so I'm starting to feel the tension, right?
Yeah.
And I'm noticing, I'm like, oh, this is it. It's happening. Like I'm having that feeling where something isn't quite feeling right. And what am I going to do? And I'm thinking, all right, I'm going to give her 2 more minutes. And if she's not out here by, quarter after, then I'm going to leave. And this wasn't like a traditional medical setting. This was like a private practice kind of situation, just her and one client in a private office. So she finally comes out. And normally I would just go with the flow. I would accuse myself of being high maintenance. Essentially I would feel like I want to defy and I wouldn't defy. So when we got in there, I had said to her, I have to be honest with you, after you didn't have us on the calendar last time and now you're pretty late this time, it's kind of undermining my trust. It's not the best first impression. So that was kind of sharing my feelings. And she was defensive. And then I said, I was going to give you 2 more minutes and then I was ready to go. And so this is where I kind of checked in. You said at this point, you might ask questions. And I said, I'm just curious, did something happen? Or is this your regular practice? And she was defensive and was like, well, this is a doctor's office, which it wasn't, by the way. And essentially she admitted that this is a pretty common pattern. And all I could think where all that tension was coming from is, I don't want to sit here and have my teenage daughter spend an hour sharing all of her most personal medical information for next week and the week after for her to be 20 minutes late or forget another appointment. And for me to then be mad at myself that I knew in that moment that I should walk away. We had never met her before. It was a brand new provider. And I knew that I should walk away. And so I did say, you know what? I'm feeling like this just isn't a good fit. And we got up and we walked away. And I was so proud of myself. So and the tension went away. I mean, I was very nervous because I would never normally do something like that. And I checked in with my daughter. I said, were you okay that I did that? Because I thought she'd be horrified that her mom was embarrassing her for like being all assertive, And she said, well, I already didn't like her anyway. So yes, I'm really glad that you did that.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's so amazing because the first time you went, there was already something, right, that made you think, how much can I trust their appointment process? And then no wonder if you're waiting, you're feeling nervous. Is the same thing going to happen again? Are they going to cancel the appointment? What's going to happen? And so communicating that is fantastic to be able to say, I'm feeling nervous. Did you have us in the calendar? What's happening? Is this normal? Because you are putting your trust into a provider. And if you don't have high trust to begin with, then the whole relationship is starting at a point where you're certainly uncertain as to what experience you're going to have. And the person at the front of the desk is really important. If you're going to go back there, if you're going to trust them, if you're going to experience this every single time, and you feel like you're being dismissed when you want to have the experience of being respected and valued and having your privacy taken into account, they're important things to you, important things that you value. So I think doing this in front of your daughter as well is something that will remain with her to know that she can do this too.
That's a great point. I hadn't thought of that. And honestly, I would have given her a chance if she had said to me, I am so sorry. This is very unusual. I happened to have a client emergency and had to give someone a few extra minutes, just like I would give your daughter extra time if she needed it. But really it was, well, I'm sorry that you can't appreciate that. And so I was like, no, because then it was like also just the attitude and the defensiveness, like it just wasn't feeling safe. And this was a mental health appointment where that, that trust and that working alliance is even more important. Really important. It was really interesting to observe the tension. Like the tension is there, but I'm going to check it out and get more information. And depending on that answer, I'm either going to consent, and we'll talk about the difference between compliance and consent, but she's either going to get a true yes or a true no. And it was unfortunate that it happened. And now I have to go back to the drawing board and find a new provider, which is not easy. And sometimes, let's talk actually, 2 things. Let's talk in a second about why we tend to comply. But before we get off this topic of tension, I also thought it was really interesting that you say there's a difference between tension and like intuition or gut feeling. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. So, as a psychologist, I suppose I always worry when people say, oh, yeah, I did this from the gut. It's a gut feeling, because the gut can give us important information, but it can also be an indication of our biases too, right? So it can be wrong. And the difference is that we need to figure out when it's right and when it's wrong. So how do we do that? So a lot of times when we have that sort of instinct, we're talking about some kind of intuition. And there is a concept that I will call expert intuition, where you see a pattern, you recognize it, you have a feeling this is what you should do because you've seen this many times before. But for expert intuition, there needs to be 3 conditions. And those conditions are, first of all, you need a predictable environment, that this happens and then this happens, right? Something that's quite predictable. You need to have immediate feedback on how your action affects that environment. So if I do this, then this happens. If I do something else, then this happens. So predictable environment, immediate feedback, accurate feedback, I should add, and then experience, practice, thousands of repetitions in that aspect. So if we think about a grand chess master, for example, they can sort of see a chessboard and they can recognize a pattern and they know, okay, if I make this move, this is likely to happen. They've seen it many times before. And so they can act with intuition. As soon as they see a pattern, they recognize it, they can do it. And it's great to have that. But many situations that we are in, we haven't experienced it hundreds of times before. We don't have immediate feedback, and it's not a predictable, stable environment. And so sometimes we need to think further about, is this tension that I'm feeling, is it about expert intuition, something that I've experienced lots of times and I'm in a predictable environment and I know the feedback I'm going to get? Or is it really just my biases speaking to me that I had this bad experience and I'm thinking it's the same thing, or like this thing makes me feel fearful because of something irrational that I learned, so being able to distinguish between the two is really important. So when I talk about tension, I'm not talking about an emotional reaction or a voice of panic or anything like that. I'm talking about holding that tension to the light and helping us see more clearly, not less. And once we can do that, often it's not loud. It's just the voice of conscience or something telling us, this isn't right. Why? And we need to ask, why isn't this right? So when you're in that office that you were in, and you feel that tension, why isn't it right? Because I want a provider that's going to treat me with respect and dignity, honor my privacy. And those things were violated in the previous interaction and in the interaction now. This doesn't feel right. So this is how I'm going to move forward. I'm going to ask some clarifying questions and I'm going to see what the communication is. Am I, again, treated with respect or not? And when you're not, then you say, I don't think I can continue. I think I need to leave. And then, then you leave.
The answer may have done the job to alleviate the tension. And when it didn't, and that tension was still there, then that leads to, okay, this is a violation of my values in an ongoing way, and I need to defy. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
So when we all hear about the Stanley Milgram experiment, when the teachers are taught to supposedly shock the learners, and the shocks aren't really happening, but the teachers don't know that. In modern times, if somebody reads about that study, they'll go, I would never do that. I would be the one to say, no, I'm not doing this. And there are so many examples of that where we believe that we would never go along with certain things, but the research actually shows that is not the case. So what does the research tell us about compliance and obedience and why it's so hard for us to resist, to defy?
Yes, there's this empathy gap where it's very difficult for us to accurately predict what we would do in that situation, because once we're in that situation, we feel very, very differently. So I say that we can predict whether or not we will consent, but not whether we will comply. So yes, when people think about, would I give somebody a harmful electric shock that could endanger their life? We'll think, oh, I wouldn't do that. When somebody follows an order and harms another person, oh no, I wouldn't do that. Well, you wouldn't want to do that, but you might do that because the research shows it's very hard once you're in that situation. If you have not practiced for it, if you've not experienced it before, if this is something new, and if you have been socialized to comply from a young age, the way that I was and many other people were, then it's going to be very difficult to say no in the moment unless we prepare before that moment of crisis. So being prepared and practicing for defiance is the most important thing. Understanding the different aspects of what it means to comply, what it means to defy, what it means to consent, and really thinking about defiance as being something positive, that you could avoid harm to someone else, you could avoid harm to yourself, you could be doing something wonderful for yourself and other people. And understanding that is critical, really, in learning how to defy in that moment.
Shopify's point of sale system helps you sell at every stage of your business. Need a fast and secure way to take payments in person? We've got you covered. How about card readers you can rely on anywhere you sell?
Thanks. Have a good one.
Yep, that too. Want one place to manage all your online and in-person sales? That's kind of our thing. Wherever you sell, businesses that grow with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 a month trial at shopify.com/listen. Shopify.com/listen.
Well, let's take a minute and talk, because we've referred to this a couple of times. What is the difference between actually giving a true consent versus compliance?
So compliance is going along with something, so usually externally imposed, an order, expectation, or even a suggestion. Whereas consent is fundamentally different. We often conflate the two, but they're actually radically different from each other. What I do to really understand what consent is, and what I also call your true yes and consent, is that I take the definition of informed consent in medicine and I apply it to other situations that we encounter in our lives. And I think this is a really useful definition for us to think about. Is this my true yes? Is this true consent, or am I just complying with the other person? So for a true yes, for consent, you actually need 5 elements. So first of all, you need capacity. So doctors, for example, will assess patients. Do they have the mental capacity? Are they too ill? Are they under the influence of any drugs or alcohol? Can they make a decision? So first of all, hopefully we have the capacity to make a decision. And then we need the knowledge. We need information about that particular decision. So we need to be given that information. We need to find that information. But it's not enough just to have the information. We need to have a thorough understanding of it. So we need to know the risks, the benefits, the alternatives, all these different aspects to have a really thorough understanding. So far we have capacity, knowledge, understanding. And then the 4th element is the freedom to say no. Because if we don't have the freedom to say no, then it's merely compliance. It's not consent. So once those 4 elements are there, then the 5th element is actually your authorization, which is a thoroughly considered authorization that's in alignment with your true values. So if you want to say yes now, that is consent. If you want to say no, that's a defiance or informed refusal. That's your true no. And that's the difference between compliance, which is a yes that's not really a yes, or being forced into something or externally imposed, versus consent and defiance, which come from within. It reflects our true values. And those 5 elements must be present.
So what do we do in the case that we may technically have the freedom to say no? That was the 4th step, the freedom to say no, right? I always think of the example, because I've been guilty of this so many times, where, I've gone to get a massage and they say, "Oh, how's the pressure?" And it's way too hard. And I'm like, "It's fine."
Yes.
Clearly they're asking the question. I have the freedom to say no, but that fear of conflict or hurting someone's feelings, or what do we do if we're kind of in a position where you might always sort of technically have the ability, the freedom to say no, but it doesn't feel like you can?
Right. So there's 2 things here. One is what you mentioned about, why don't we speak up to the massage therapist?
Right.
And we can talk about sort of the psychological process that I've discovered in my research that I call insinuation anxiety, that this kind of anxiety or concern that we feel about insinuating anything bad to another person. So especially when they're standing right in front of you. So we don't want to imply that somebody is incompetent, they're applying too much force, they gave you a bad haircut, or they're giving you bad food. You don't want to imply that someone also cannot be trusted or is biased. And so we often follow sort of bad advice, or we don't speak up when we should. And that actually can be it can be something small, like with a massage therapist, even though that could leave you with bruises. But it also could be something quite significant, like with one survey found that on average, 9 out of 10 healthcare workers, most of them nurses, did not speak up when they saw a colleague or a physician making a mistake. So that could be explained by insinuation anxiety. They don't want to call out someone for making an error. And it could also be the reason why co-pilots remain silent and they don't say anything to their superiors when they see a mistake. So you can imagine if you're in that hospital or on that airplane, you want these people to be speaking up. But we always feel something. And insinuation anxiety, that feeling, could be that tension right at the beginning that we need to acknowledge. But you're right in that freedom to say no. It's not just about, oh, well, somebody was pointing a gun at my head, and so I didn't have any freedom to say no. That is true. And physical danger is an important aspect of complying, right? If you're in physical danger, then sometimes you need to comply, or you could lose your life. If you're not prepared to lose your life in that situation, then compliance might be the best strategy. But you could also have other costs, like financial costs, psychological costs, other types of costs that are really important. And people talk a lot about this in organizations, that if I speak up the way that this organization is that I'm most likely to get fired. And so what we can do in these situations is consciously comply. So it's not the type of compliance where we slide into it without thinking. We are actually aware of all the elements of consent, and technically they might be there, but we are deciding in this case that the costs are too high or the benefits are too meager, that in this situation we're going to comply. That doesn't mean that we're going to disregard our values continuously, but we're going to sort of find a time when we feel a little bit safer and defer that defiance for another day. So a little bit safer where the costs might not be so great. Maybe we can get some allies. Maybe we can find some more information, or we can find an alternative that reduces those costs. So we're deferring defiance for another day, because if we continue to consciously comply in situations, it really does have a toll. So we often think about the costs of defiance, I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose a relationship. I'm going to be affected in this way. And we focus on those, and they are the things that keep us silent. But we don't think in the same way about the costs of compliance, which are really quite high if we're constantly bowing our head to other people, if we're constantly putting aside our values and sacrificing those. It can take a toll on us emotionally, psychologically, and then, of course, physically, if it leads to stress, burnout, dissatisfaction. All of these things affect us. And so really thinking about the costs of compliance as well as defiance is critical.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this specifically, and I recently read Christine Blasey Ford's amazing memoir. I think you talk in the book about Rosa Parks. I'm currently reading Careless People, which is the memoir by Sarah Wynne Williams, who is at Facebook. And with all of these women, speaking up and defying had massively negative consequences. I mean, Christine Blasey Ford's life was truly ruined for quite some time. And yet, in every case, if you ask them, do you regret speaking up? They always say no. And, maybe a cynic would call that cognitive dissonance.
Right.
But, I have a feeling it's exactly what you're saying, is that when we show up and choose to truly live our values, especially when that's the harder thing to do, the costs are immense, but the overall benefits make those costs worth it. And I had shared with you, I emailed you a little while ago in preparation for this, that And actually, I shared an essay with you recently about a story I had where my brother was incarcerated for possession of child pornography. And we discuss it. It's episode 394 that we call Sunlight is the Best Disinfectant. And I interviewed Andrea Dunlop, who's an expert in Munchausen by proxy. And so we basically are talking about this like very human tendency to stick our head in the sand, even in the face of pretty objective evidence. And when I had shared that with you, you said, I think you're going to like chapter 4, which I think is where the insinuation anxiety. And of course, when I got to it, I was like, oh my God, yes, this is it. I observed an adult male grooming my daughter, but I wasn't 100% sure that's what I was seeing. And I was so afraid of making an accusation that wasn't accurate about something quite awful, right? That like how horrible that would be. And, ultimately, long story short, that the whole thing resulted in several lost friendships for me. It was all extremely traumatic. And I don't use that word lightly. It's still something I don't feel like I'm over. And yet, I wish I had handled it differently. I wish I had handled it more skillfully. But I sure am glad that it came out, given what the alternative would have been.
And I think there's a few things here. So one, when you're talking about Rosa Parks and other whistleblowers, and I also talk about Jeffrey Wigand, they did experience immense costs. And it's important to recognize those costs. And even though they couldn't predict exactly, they knew, they had an idea that this is going to be costly. So really consciously knowing what it takes is important, even if you can't predict it exactly. And what most people think about when they're in a particular situation is this safe and is it going to be effective? And figuring out when is the right time to speak up, because many people and many whistleblowers, they have hundreds of moments of compliance that precede the moment of defiance. And there is where the costs are also taking a toll, the costs of compliance. So Rosa Parks had complied with segregation laws on the bus for many times before the day that she said, no, I'm not going to move for a white passenger. And her reaction was based on emotion, but it wasn't emotional. It wasn't emotional on that day. It was actually quite strategic. And yet she knew that there would be costs, and there were costs of that, but so was disregarding her values continuously, day in and day out. So we need to be aware that sometimes there's costs, sometimes there isn't, but sometimes there is. It's a risk. Defiance is a risk, but so is compliance, continuing with that. And in your situation, it was compounded with insinuation anxiety, because even implying that somebody cannot be trusted, or like implying that somebody has, if somebody in your office makes a joke at somebody else's expense, like sort of speaking up and sort of saying something when everybody else is laughing is very hard, right? Are you implying I'm sexist or racist? Nobody likes to do that. And yet there are ways that once you understand, insinuation anxiety is the fear of saying something negative to someone else when they're right in front of you. So how can we handle that? So first of all, just being aware that this is a concern that we have, sort of naming it, feeling it, and then trying to get some distance, either physical or psychological, can often make us see this is the right thing that I have to do in this situation. And here you're talking about, well, I wasn't 100% sure. Maybe we never are. Sometimes we are 100% sure, and we still have insinuation anxiety because we know for certain that person said something deeply offensive, deeply racist, and yet it's very hard to say something in the office. So there's little scripts that we can take once we understand this is insinuation anxiety. We can just ask, Stage 3, clarifying question. What do you mean by that? That might be enough, right? Just putting that out there has changed like the water in which everyone is swimming. Other people have heard it. That person might be less likely to do that again when in your presence, maybe less likely to do it when the other people are there. Maybe they think about it more and decide not to ever say that. Maybe they don't, but you've created a change in the system. And in your case, it was also about protecting your child. So here it does become important because the cost of of simply complying with it is huge. And it's, again, remembering to take into consideration, is it safe? Is it effective? And what are the costs of compliance as well as the costs of defiance?
Yeah. I think you talk in that same chapter, there's something called the sales pitch effect that's related but different. Can you talk about how that's different, but how the insinuation anxiety and sales pitch effect can sometimes work together to make people compliant?
So even when all the elements of consent are there, these are some of the psychological processes that keep us sort of tripped up and keep us complying. And both of these things, insinuation anxiety and the sales pitch effect, increase the pressure to comply when we don't trust the other person, right? That in essence, this increased pressure to comply comes from these psychological processes. So insinuation anxiety is that concern of insinuating or implying that someone cannot be trusted, somebody is incompetent, somebody is biased, some negative evaluation of some kind, or even rejecting somebody's sexual advances, right, is often hard to do because you're insinuating that they're unattractive to you. And we sometimes don't like to do that because we like to send positive evaluations to other people. So that's insinuation anxiety. Whereas the sales pitch effect is this concern of not being seen as being helpful. It's the pressure to be helpful when you know that the other person is going to benefit, but maybe you are not going to benefit from something. So it could be like when you're in a store buying some clothes and you know that the shop assistant is working on commission. So even though they tell you that the jacket looks fantastic and you know that it's out of your budget, but you still go along with it because you feel like you have to help them, or you have to buy something from someone who comes to your door because you feel pressure to help them. One really nice way to sort of think about the distinction between the two is that, say, for example, you go to buy a car. You know that the car salesperson is going to be working on commission. So there is some aspect of the sales pitch effect that if you don't get it, then you're going to deny this person their commission. But if that salesperson is a dear friend of yours and tells you that this car is right for you, now you also have insinuation anxiety because you're telling them that you don't trust their judgment for you as a friend when they should have your best interests at heart.
So it's like a double whammy to fight against those two things together.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. So usually we have insinuation anxiety and it's stronger when there's a power differential too. And you expect the other person to have your best interests at heart. So it becomes very difficult, for example, to tell your doctor that you don't want to take this particular piece of advice or procedure. Perhaps they're working on a fee for service and they're going to get more money. And that might be part of the equation. Maybe it's not, but it's very difficult to tell someone that is supposed to have your best interests at heart that you don't trust them. Whereas the sales pitch effect, both the car salesperson and you both know that they're working on commission. And so it's really hard to sort of say like, oh, well, you both know it, you both know it at that time, but it also might be difficult to indicate distrust if you've spent an hour with this other person that they've tried to build some rapport with you. So often both can be present, but they both work in the same direction, which is to just increase the pressure to comply and make you feel uncomfortable about rejecting it because of some signal you're sending to them. So the signal could be that you don't trust them or that you're uncooperative, you don't want to be helpful to the other person.
And so other than the steps of defiance, the tension, the acknowledgement, the vocalizing, threat of noncompliance, finally saying no. Is there anything else that you recommend for like when we get stuck? Or, I think you were saying we might notice the tension, but that's kind of where we stop or backtrack or, still end up complying because of insinuation anxiety or the sales pitch effect, the feared consequences, whatever it may be. What do you recommend for people? Like if they do feel the tension and acknowledge it, how do we get over the hump to keep going if we really do get to that point of feeling like I don't want to comply?
Right. So I think A really powerful tool that has helped me and other people that I sort of either teach or work with is what I call the Defiance Compass, where we ask ourselves 3 questions. And one of the reasons for the Defiance Compass is really to decrease that gap between who we think we are and how we actually behave. Because if my research has shown anything, it's like time and time again, like who we think we are does not align with how we actually behave in the situation. And we were talking about this, that we think that we'll do the right thing in a situation. We think that we'll speak up. We think we won't harm anyone else. We think we can say no. But then when we're actually in that situation, we don't act in the way that we would aspire to. So how can we get close to that? And how can we decrease that gap? So there is 3 questions, and the last one is the most important for this, but because the first question is, who am I? And that is work that you can do long before any type of situation. That's merely just identifying your values. What is it that's important to you? Is it respect? Is it integrity? Is it equality? These are things that it's not about like a moral conviction that, abortion is wrong or homosexuality is right. It's not about those types of moral judgments. It's about how do we want to enact these values on a day-to-day basis. It's not about whether something is right or wrong, which is subjective, and there's always more than one answer, but it's about like integrity is really important to me, and I always want to act with integrity. Or respect is really important to me, or equality is really important to me. And I want to live my life in a way where I show that I value equality and I try to bring equality into every situation that I encounter. So who am I is the first question. The second question, which we've covered a little bit, is what type of situation is this? Where we're looking at the situation and we're figuring out, is it safe? Is it effective to me? So is it going to be safe? Is it going to be effective to defy? So assessing those costs, both costs of defiance and costs of compliance, we're now looking outwards. Then the last question is, what does a person like me do in a situation like this? So here we're connecting with our responsibilities. So what does a person like me with these values, fairness, equality, compassion, integrity, whatever your values are, what does a person like me do in a situation like this? So we're tapping in to our aspirational selves, because if there are values, which is what it leads back to as a compass, a sort of circular thing, how we act in this situation is going to affect who we are. Are we going to act in alignment with our values or not? And that is what defiance is acting in alignment with our values when there's pressure to do otherwise. So that question is really quite powerful, and it requires us to connect with our values, our responsibilities, but you also still need the ability to defy. And if you don't have the skill set, then you can't complete that last set. So that's the kind of missing piece there. But it's also really, if you are feeling that tension, is to connect with your values and understand, this is a situation I want to defy. And then knowing that you've built that practice, that you have the skill set, because that is what you need in the situation. You can't expect yourself to have it in the moment of crisis. You need to be building it before that moment of crisis. Yeah. And there's many ways you can do that.
Well, that was my next question, is what are, other than just saying no or leaving the office and not following through with the doctor, like what does it take? And I think about the story I told you about watching the grooming, and I did not handle it skillfully. I knew what I wanted to do and say, but I didn't handle it skillfully. So what are some ways that people can learn to do that more skillfully?
Well, I think your situation was particularly hard because, first of all, it's a high stakes situation, one that you were in. Insinuation anxiety is really hard in that situation. And plus, this might be something completely new to like, what do I do? I've never even thought about this situation before. Now, I have thought about this type of situation, but not exactly the one that you are describing, in that when my child was younger and there was a school trip and parents or teachers could go and they would be be in a room with just one or two children. And I was like, well, I need to ask, what is the vetting process for these people? Because that is the time. They're so young at this point. Would my son tell me if something happened? And I did have concerns, and I did want to know what the vetting process was, or background checks, or anything that would make me feel more secure about this. And so situations that are a surprise or unique or catch us off guard make it very difficult for us to defy. The way that we learn how to defy is by practice, because the only thing that changes our neural pathways, if we have been socialized to comply, the only thing that's going to change our neural pathways is to actually do that behavior, not just intellectually understand it, but to actually have the behavioral training, because that's going to get those neural pathways to fire. So how do we do that? Well, probably in many of these situations, we've complied before. Like Rosa Parks had complied before. I have been very compliant at work and many other situations in my life. And then so we can start anticipating, that person is going to say something in this faculty meeting because that person has said something in every other faculty meeting, or that's what they're likely to do. So we start anticipating it. And when I was speaking to a rookie police officer, he said to me that when he started his job, he knew it was going to be difficult. He knew he was going to get asked to do unethical things. And just that anticipation is really, really important. So let's start anticipating these things, because once that we do, a lot of these situations we see are predictable. Not every single one, but many of them are predictable. Then we can start visualizing that situation and start scripting what we wish we had said, what we want to say, what is our aspirational self. And it could be something just small scripts that we have for those situations that catch us off guard. Like, what do you mean by that? Oh, I'm not comfortable with this. Have we thought about a different way of doing that? But just having some scripts of situations that you have encountered before that you wish you would have said. We often have regret about it and we think, oh, this is what I wish I had said. So having those written out and practicing it. So your ears get used to hearing it, your mouth gets used to saying it. This is what changes the neural pathways. And there's a wonderful quote that really helps bring this home. And it's often attributed to Bruce Lee, which is kind of apt because it is really about training. But it was actually a Greek poet that said, under duress, we don't rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training. And that's why we need to see defiance not as a personality, but as a practice. It's a skill set that we can choose to utilize or not. And we need to practice it long before the moment of crisis.
And so probably we can practice with low stakes events first, like getting a massage.
Exactly. Yes.
Right? As like if we can, it seems like the very first thing, and we talked about this right in the beginning, the very first thing is becoming aware of that tension first and foremost, like really tuning in and noticing like, wow, I'm feeling really uncomfortable. What is happening here? And then being able to practice following through with that defiance in those lower stakes moments. And as you master that and you're able to do that more successfully, and the sky doesn't fall, whatever the feared outcome is doesn't occur and you can handle it, then it kind of increases that ability to take on and tackle higher stakes or more difficult situations.
Yes, that is exactly right, that we want to practice in those small stakes situations. We want to say, I'm not quite comfortable with this. Just start practicing, because then you change the neural pathways and it becomes easier for you. Like what felt unnatural at first starts to feel more natural. And we also have to remember, like one of the biggest things is that we often think about defiance as being loud and aggressive and violent even, or just this negative trait. And it doesn't have to be that way. It's simply acting in alignment with your values. It can be quite quiet and it can be done in a way that's very respectful, especially if that's one of your values. It's simply acting in alignment with your values. That's all. It doesn't have to be loud or aggressive. We can all do it in our own unique way with far less angst than we used to do. It's available. It's a skill set and it's available and it's necessary for all of us to learn how to utilize that skill set.
Well, I think that is the perfect place to end the interview. That's so well said. I absolutely loved this book. I cannot recommend it enough. Again, the title is Defy, The Power of No in a World That Demands Yes. Oh, I'm getting choked up. This is this has been so impactful for me. And I have a big decision to make because I very much value this idea that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I have an opportunity to basically tell my story on a very large television platform. And my family doesn't want me to do it. And so I'm finding myself in a position where I need to really think about it. Feels like I have competing values because my family and their feelings matter to me and our relationships matter to me. But being someone who speaks the truth and speaks up and talks about things that other people don't talk about, that I think if more people talked about them, we would live in a much better world. And it's going to be a very big decision. And I am just so grateful that I found and read this book and was able to talk to you today. And I'm going to sit down and start writing out the 3 questions and see if I can really come to a place of either consciously complying or defying. So I'll let you know how it goes. So thank you so much for being here today. This was wonderful. If people want to find you, if they want to learn more, what is the best place that they can do that?
The best place is to go to my website, which is sunitasah.com. So that's SUN, like the sun in the sky, SUNITA, SAH is my last name, .com. And there you can take a Defiance quiz to find out your Defiance style. You can sign up for my newsletter, which is called Defiant by Design, because it has to be by design. That's on Substack, is free. And you'll find ways to connect with me on social media too, on LinkedIn, on Instagram. So pay a visit to my website. Everything is there, including links to buy the book.
Perfect. Well, we will put all of that information in the show notes. And I know when we hang up, I am going to go subscribe to your Substack. That's great.
Thank you so much, Jill. This was wonderful to speak to you, and all the best with that decision. Just really connect with what your values are and who you feel responsible for. So,
yeah. Thank you. I'm here with Debbie to talk about the episode you just finished listening to with Sunita Sah about her book, Defy. Debbie, what are your thoughts?
Oh, this was such a powerful conversation. I kept pausing it to take notes because I wanted to remember it. And I found it to be applicable in so many ways. I was thinking about some examples of day-to-day things, like when I was volunteering with my child and we wanted to leave early because we were kind of standing around doing nothing and we wanted to go get ice cream. And she was like, "Mom, can we go? We literally were doing nothing. There were all these volunteers and it was the end. And I felt like, we can't leave early. We agreed to volunteer." And then I was like, but we can. And actually, if it wasn't for her, I think I would have just stayed for no reason, but I did it, and I think
I love that.
And so that level, but then also I, in my mind, kept thinking about politics. And, you mentioned the Milgram experiments and how people sometimes will just go along with authority, even when authority is doing the wrong thing. And there's this book that I think a lot of people have heard of. It's called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. It's by Timothy Snyder, who's a history professor at Yale, although I've heard is potentially one of the people who's leaving the United States. But the book offers 20 lessons on resisting modern day fascism. And the very first one is, do not comply in advance. And I think what happens a lot of times is that governments come in and put people in these binds. And I think there's a lot of binds going on right now where people are having to make hard decisions. Do I give this information versus stand up for myself, even if it's at personal cost? Do I do the right thing or speak out, even if it could end up getting me into trouble? But I think sometimes it's like, well, how do you stand up? How do you avoid complying in advance?
Yeah.
And so it's helpful to hear some actual tools for doing that. So I think, for example, some people right now who are maybe running law firms or universities or government programs, or they're getting grant funding and they're being asked to do things in order to keep their funding or in order to get, keep their business going or have personal gains, but sometimes—
And they're being asked to do things that are counter to their own personal values. And so they're in this double bind of, I either need to provide you information that you're going to use against vulnerable people, or I'm going to lose my job or lose my funding. And like, what an awful position.
Exactly. And that tension you talked about, this is moral injury. This is having to make really, really hard decisions. And I think that at this moment, a lot of people are in that situation. And I think that it's possible that more and more people will be, do I speak out or not? do I comply or not? And it's a very hard decision. And I think one thing that this conversation offers is a really useful framework and also some skills for, okay, how do I avoid compliance? How do I speak up? How do I resist? It's not always easy to do that.
Well, and one of the things I found the most helpful for me personally, and I think really does apply with what you're saying here, is it's not necessarily just this black and white. Either I'm defying or I'm rolling over and giving in. There is this middle ground that she talks about, the conscious compliance, which is I am clear on I notice the tension. I'm clear on my values. I know what I want to do. But the costs, they're just too high right now. And so I might be saying yes, but it's not in this automatic reactive way. It's in a thought out way, and it's for now. And that over time, like when the timing is right, when the costs are manageable, because they might not ever disappear completely, but when they're manageable, then maybe that's the time that I can choose to comply. And honestly, you know, I mentioned in the episode about how I had this choice to make about whether to go on this TV program. And since I recorded that with her, I have come to a decision, so I can report it right now in the episode, that essentially this is something that my family doesn't want me to do. And they think that there are going to be quite high costs if I were to do it. And it feels important to me, if I'm thinking just about my values, I would like to do it. And what I'm choosing right now is conscious compliance, that their input and how they feel is important to me. And the costs of doing this do feel very high. So I'm going to choose to say no, but I'm only saying no for right now. And I have conditions in my mind, like if X, Y, or Z happens, then all bets are off. And then I am going to be willing to put myself and my voice out there. And that just feels like a decision that I can live with, even though it's not like 100% what I want to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah. You've been telling me a little bit about what you've been grappling with her, and I just really appreciate how intentional you are about making this decision. I know you've thought really hard about it. You've sat with it. You've had conversations. I just think you have really done a good job of thinking it through and making an intentional decision.
And that's it, right? Like when you
Yes.
go back to that quote from On Tyranny about don't comply in advance, the opposite of that is intentionality. And I think
Yes.
that is so much of what I got out of this is waking up, noticing the tension, and then being intentional, where this is like a conscious, deliberate choice where you're really weighing the risks, the benefits, you know, et cetera,
Yeah.
and not just reacting on autopilot to do whatever's the most comfortable.
Yeah. And I work with clients a lot on setting boundaries. And I always tell them, you have the choice. You know, you have to pick your battles. Sometimes you let some small ones go just because it's not worth it. And I really do think that idea of being intentional is really important. And if your tendency is to knee-jerk say yes, I think that, you know, sometimes we have to work on that, building up that muscle of saying no and setting boundaries. So I really
100%. And I loved that. I think it was the very end of the interview. We talked about like, you can practice by starting where the stakes are small.
Yes.
And that felt doable to me. Because if I'm only thinking about fighting tyranny, you know, that seems like a really tall mountain.
It's on you.
Really tall mountain to climb. But if I'm just, you know, telling the massage therapist not to rub my muscles so hard, like that feels like something I can manage. And then, you know, the more you master that, the easier it becomes to practice over time.
Exactly. And then you can fight tyranny as you get
as you make your way up the mountain. Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we hope you all got as much out of this episode as Debbie and I did, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.